And we're live.
And we're live. Coming out at work, is it good for you? That's what we're talking about on the very first Queer Money follow-up, episode number 1. And we're following up on Queer Money podcast, episode number 1, which was titled Coming Out at Work. On that show, we discussed the risks and concerns of coming out at work as LGBT with former Executive Vice President and Human Resources from Charles Schwab, Jay Allen, and former Executive Director of One Colorado and former Chief of Staff of GLAAD New York City, Dave Montez. So, David.
It's really cool because when we recorded this, we got to hear coming out stories of folks from the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, which was interesting to see some parallels in how things have changed. It was also our very first.
It was our first
Queer Money
published
podcast
episode.
right? And remember, we reminded you last night when we did our first live that we started this whole process way back in 2016. And what was so interesting about this first episode is that when we re-listened to it, we totally recognize the massive changes that have happened, not just in our ability to record and present a podcast and the sound quality, but also the kinds of changes that have happened for the LGBT community when it comes to coming out at work and the legalities and the protections and things that we really should be celebrating. It's really amazing. We recorded this episode back, the Queer Money episode 1 in 2016. And what was so surprising is that back then, only 22 states had LGBT protections, LGBT, lesbian, gay, and bisexual protections, and only 19 had protections for transgender folks that were a part of the workplace protections. And if you fast forward to 2020, the middle of 2020, before the Supreme Court decision, there was massive progress.
Absolutely.
30 states had protections for lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, and 28 had protections for transgender folks. So there was massive progress. But then we also know what happened in the middle of 2020, that we had this nationwide mandate that came from the Supreme Court that basically said that companies, individuals, they cannot discriminate against us based on our sexual orientation and gender identity, which is that particular Supreme Court decision was something that we discussed in our on the Queer Money podcast back on episode 218, which was that's
In July, I think.
Yeah.
So
6
I think,
ago.
I think it obviously we definitely want to celebrate the decision of the Supreme Court and to lay the law of the land for everybody. And that protects LGBT people, and that also helps us with our personal finances. But what I think is interesting is that between 2016 and the middle of 2020, we did have such progress at the state level with states implementing their own protections, up to 30 states for LGBT and 28 for the transgender folks. So I think that's kind of showing a changing of the perceptions of individuals and those at the state level in America, and I think that's exciting. But I think definitely we want to celebrate the protections for employment, because not only does that help people every day in the workplace, but also that helps build the financial security of LGBT people, which we're still working on, and we're still behind, but we're making progress.
Right. That's interesting you bring that up, because I think we talked about this earlier, that when it comes to our lives, where we work and how we make our money and the money that we make is only a small portion of who we are as individuals, and we definitely need that income, and we need a safe place to work, but we also have to remember that there's other aspects to our lives that can add value, and that we can come out in other places just besides work.
Exactly. And it's this is good for LGBT people, this is good for business, and then obviously this is good for the economy, because we know, as Jay mentioned, and as we've seen in studies since then, including when we interviewed Todd Sears from Out Leadership on Queer Money episode 108, when we talked about return on equality, is that companies that are diverse and that embrace their diverse workforce get more out of their employees.
Right.
One, they get better employees. Two, they get more out of their employees. And so that helps the bottom line. So if your job is to help grow the bottom line, if your job is to help and satisfy your investors, then you want to have a diverse workforce. And not only does that help the business, but that helps LGBT people be able to bring their full selves to the office.
Right. I think that one of the reasons why we had Jay Allen on the podcast was because Jay was that senior executive at Schwab when we worked there who did some mentoring for us. And he really highlighted to Charles Schwab, the company, that it is very important that you come to work and give 100%, right? You're being paid to give 100%. And if you're holding back something, then you're not able to give 100%, which I think really drives home this point that when you're looking for work, you want to make sure you're looking for a company that you can be 100% yourself, which one of the things that we talked about in this episode was that whole idea of when you are looking at a company and maybe you're looking for a new job, it may be maybe behoove you to actually interview the company before you actually go to the interview by doing things like checking to see whether or not they have a non-discrimination policy. Does that non-discrimination policy match what the federal government or the one that your state had, if you had one? Knowing that they had that kind of legacy policy in place will kind of give you a little idea about how maybe that company treats their employees, not just LGBT folks, but all folks. And one of the ways you can do that is by calling the HR department of that company and asking them, can you send me a copy of your non-discrimination policy? May not want to highlight or ask based on being LGBT. Specifically, just say, can I see your non-discrimination policies? Because remember, non-discrimination policies should apply to all of the protected classes of individuals. When you think about women, individuals based on race, religion, there's a variety of things that non-discrimination policy would want to protect. So it's kind of our job to do a little bit of legwork about this company. That way we can maybe protect ourselves beforehand.
Yeah, exactly. You definitely want to interview the company as much as they're interviewing you. So you can call the HR department to ask for that information. You could probably do some research online. There is obviously the HRC, Corporate Equality Index, and then there's OutBureau that does some ratings as well on various corporations, and also provides. And we interviewed the founder of OutBureau several years back on the Queer Money podcast as well. And I'm just remembering that now, so I don't have the episode number. But they also provide real life examples of whether or not people are being treated equal in the workplace when they're LGBTQ.
Yeah.
So
I was going to say, one of the other things that we didn't necessarily touch on specifically in this episode, but it was kind of highlighted in our discussion, was this idea that sometimes discrimination isn't overt, right? I mean, Jay shared his story of that.
Yeah, exactly. So, as David said on the outset, we had stories of coming out at work from those in the 80s, those in the 90s, and those in the aughts. And it was interesting to hear all the different experiences that folks had. And Jay talked about how when he was in corporate America in the 80s, and he shared his coming out story, and he said he didn't think it was really going to be that big of a deal. And it wasn't there wasn't an overt response, but he and his colleagues and his manager as well started to realize that there was just some subtle discrimination that was going on, and that he was getting overlooked for promotions that he was more than qualified for. And ultimately it came down to, well, we think that you're being discriminated against. Right. And at that time he didn't have much recourse, right? That was totally legal for that company at that time to do that. So his only option was to just either stay there and tolerate the way he was being treated, or to jump ship and go to another company. And fortunately, he had he was fortunate enough to be able to just jump ship and go to another company, and that eventually proved beneficial for him. That's not available to everybody. And so I asked him in that interview, I said, in hindsight, what would you have told yourself what to look out for when to see if you were being discriminated against, even at a subversive level? And he said, you just kind of got to be aware. You've got to be vigilant. See how people are responding to you. See how your colleagues are responding to you. Pay attention to what how your manager's treating you. See if your annual performance reviews are matching your actual performance, and they can provide quantifiable data just as much as you can provide quantifiable data.
Right.
And if there's consistently a conflict there might actually be a conflict with you being LGBT. And so at that point, you might want to decide whether or not you want to jump ship yourself, or you just have to suck it up and tolerate it. Or file at this point, because we have the benefit, we can file a legal claim. But of course, that opens up another can of worms, and that's not necessarily
Right.
something that many folks want to do. But what I think this does underscore is that even though we now have, the Supreme Court has implemented these protections across land, it's just as important for us as ever before to pay attention, be very vigilant to how we're being treated, and make sure we protect ourselves. So as we said in that episode 218 of the Queer Money podcast, document. Every time you get an award, every time you get a commendation, every time somebody says something positive to you, archive that. Make sure you keep track of all the projects and all the successes that you've had yourself throughout the year, so that when it's time for you to do your annual review, you've got your arsenal of information. And if there's conflict between what you have and what your manager has, especially over year, then you know that there might be something more to it.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of the topic that we had on episode 230, again, a couple of months back, the idea of cascading homophobia. Just for if you're hearing this term for the very first time, the way we define cascading homophobia is when an individual who you are maybe reporting to, or that you are looking for a promotion from, they find it easier to say no to you than saying or explaining to someone above them that there is a reason why they hired you or promoted you, being LGBT. So really what's happening is senior individuals maybe either overtly or maybe covertly in their conversations talked about how they are not comfortable with queer folks, and that puts a downward pressure on individuals to then say, I'd rather not hire you, or I'd rather not promote you or give you this project because you're queer, because then I'm going to have to go back to my boss or this individual and explain to them why I did that, or maybe it could affect me. So there's this whole idea of they may be saying they're an ally, but on the appearance only, because they don't allow it to, or they allow this downward pressure, this downward homophobia.
Well, they might be an ally, but they might be a weak ally, right? Because they still want to protect their jobs. They still have spouses and children and bills to tend to, and as much as they might want to be an activist on your behalf, they've got other concerns to consider as well, and so they might not necessarily be able to be as strong as we would always want them to be. And again, I think that underscores the need for us as individuals being LGBT. That's sort of incumbent upon us to pay attention and be vigilant to how we're being treated, and then hopefully we have the courage and the wherewithal and the means to be able to stand up for ourselves. Not everybody, again, has that. If you're desperate for a job yourself as being LGBT, it might be safer for you to try to pass or cover and as straight and not ruffle anybody's feathers. But again, on the flip side, then there are a lot of us who do have the option to be able to be a little bit more out and open. It's easier for us to say that as cis white gay men. We have a little bit more liberties than maybe everybody else has, and so it's incumbent upon us, to the extent that we can, because everybody's situation is unique, is to make sure that we're as out as we can be, because that can maybe we can trickle the cascade the acceptance down.
Right. Well, it kind of reminds me of Harvey Milk was a big proponent of, if you want to walk down the street holding your partner's hand, walk down the street holding your partner's hand. And I think that was exactly what Jay said during the interview. But Harvey Milk really pointed out that if we want to see more queer people out, we have to be out. We have to lead that. Now, again, I think we need to take into consideration that still roughly 25% of the LGBT community lives in cities and towns cities that are less than 250,000. So there's a lot of folks who are living in rural areas where maybe acceptance is not as prevalent as maybe living in a big city or working for a big company. So you need to take that into consideration. But those of us who can be out really should be out. That way we do push that acceptance and that awareness, especially for the benefit of those who cannot. And I think a lot of that we have to think about folks in the transgender community who cannot come out or who haven't been able to come out.
Yeah, and the numbers and the tide are on our side.
Yes.
We referenced in that Queer Money episode number 1 a Bloomberg article that said that individuals are 15% more productive at work when they can bring their whole selves at work, and that's including their LGBTQ selves.
Right.
We're going to interview Paul Donovan on the Queer Money podcast on April 6th, episode 256, and he wrote the book Profit and Prejudice that we're going to interview him about. And his data shows that people being able to be their true selves, being able to be their true selves at work increases their productivity by 25 to 30%. So not only do we have the Supreme Court saying acceptance is important, but we have at the state level, people are saying acceptance is important. But then we also have the data saying it's better for the bottom line. So
Right.
literally, if you're going to be a business owner and you're also going to be discriminating against people, you can't serve two masters. You either got to be a bigot or you got to be a business owner, because otherwise your business is going to fail.
Right. Yeah.
So I guess ultimately, what do we think the ultimate takeaway is? In summary, based on what we talked about 5 years ago and what we know now, what do we think the ultimate takeaway is?
I think for me personally, just looking at what has transpired is that massive progress that has happened over the last 5 years for the LGBT community makes it easier for more folks to come out. I'm not saying easier for you personally, but it does make it easier for more of us to come out. And that's the reason why more of us should come out. That way more of our stories get told to people that whole idea of I can't hate somebody or I can't dislike somebody that I know. It's much harder to do that. So come out. If you can, come out at work. It's important because you never know who it might be affecting. I think of maybe there's a parent there that you work with who has a queer child,
Right.
and they struggle with it. And seeing your example could help them understand or to appreciate that they need to accept their child. And that's I think that's really important for future generations of queer people.
Exactly. So thank you for joining us for another episode of Queer Money Follow-Up. Here's your Queer Money Follow-Up takeaway from this episode. For those of us who can, it's critical to not hide our true selves because not everyone has that ability. Yet there are safety in numbers and the tide is on our side.
Right.
Lastly, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, continue the conversation in the comments below or in the Queer Money Facebook group, and subscribe to the Queer Money podcast at debtfreeguys.com/QM.
All right.
All right, we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.